The Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show, off and running on another week of broadcasting here at KPCG and kpcg.fm. Over the weekend here in the UK, we had a program titled America in Crisis, and we were excited about that one just because we advertised America Under Attack, which we haven't put out there for probably a couple of years. So it brought in just 132 requests, but good to get that booklet out, as well as Great Again, a good companion study to AUA. And speaking of programs, my father, by the way, some of you might have seen this in an email on Friday, but he recorded a show last Wednesday on the riots prophesied, and as you might have seen in the email, it's a very strong program, and one that we hope will make it through to all of the TV stations across North America and beyond. So that's something that you might be praying about, because these are messages that the world needs at this time. They need to know why these events are happening. They need answers. A lot of people have questions. A lot of people are very disturbed right now. And God's truth, as hard as it might be to accept, God's truth is what we need. God's answers, that's what we should be seeking. And yet, you can see just how strong that spirit is from the radical left, and they control so many levers of media, so many TV stations, and the content that goes out, and the things that are tweeted or not tweeted or deleted, as we've covered recently on this program. Of course, we're very familiar with that prophecy in Amos 8, where it says there will be a famine of the word. There, right at the last days, there will be a famine of God's truth. It makes you appreciate what we have access to now with this show, with the Trumpet.com, with the Trumpet magazine, and of course, the Key of David. I wanted to start this segment going back to that contentious press conference that the president had following the tragedy at Charlottesville. And as you might remember, he went back and forth over the protesters and pulling down statues. And the reporters, of course, back then, they said, now, come on, it's quite a bit different to pull down a statue of a Confederate soldier and one of the founding fathers. I mean, we're not talking about the founding fathers here. Here's what the president said and some of the reporters back and forth in August of 2017. Clip 11.
Excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
Washington and Robert E. Lee are not the same.
Well, no, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him?
I do love
Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture.
You're changing history and you're changing culture, he said there. And if you heard, that was Jim Acosta in the background that said, well, there's a big difference between Robert E. Lee and George Washington. We'll never come after, the big guns. Well, and that's what they've been doing. And the president, as he has been about a lot of things, he was right on that. And it just shows you, as we touched on at the end of last week, he's really one of the few. He's maybe the last one standing, upholding tradition and the norms of our society that go back centuries. So many other people just want to root it out and bury it forever. They pulled down the Robert E. Lee statue, I believe, in Virginia just recently. And then you have all these protests and riots. And here in the UK, they're in the same spirit. They're following their brothers and sisters in the United States. rampaging through the streets, pulling down statues. This is a picture of the famous Churchill statue in London, right by all the government buildings. One of my favorite stops on the Walking London tour. This amazing statue of Winston Churchill, and you can see there that it's been defaced. It says Churchill was a racist. So now Churchill's the problem. Very sad to see this happening to our society. Not that long ago, Churchill was fighting against the forces of fascist tyranny. And now people are being brought up in the educational system of today, in our own nations. And they're made to believe that he's the villain. He's the problem. That the founding fathers are the problem. This is some kind of psychological warfare, and it has been going on for decades. This is not about George Floyd. This is not justice for George Floyd. It's much bigger than that. Psychological warfare. Mr. Armstrong said this Marxist warfare uses every diabolical means to weaken us from within. And that's what we're seeing. We're being weakened every day. And the attack, they just advance farther and farther and farther every day, every week, every month, every year, unless you stand against it. And that's exactly what the policemen are not doing at the moment. They're not standing against it. They're running from the protesters. Play that clip, Sam. That's number 11, I believe. Run, piggy, run. That's what one of them said. You heard all the objects falling to the ground, glasses and such. And then the BBC, of course, there to helpfully point out that it's mostly peaceful. It's mostly peaceful. They're following in the tradition of CNN. These are peaceful protests. There's not really any violence to speak of. The police are running. The police of Great Britain, the police in London are running from the protesters. And what do you think the criminal mind is thinking of these images? What are the crooks thinking? The burglars, the murderers? And really on both sides, I'll get later to another article talking about the backlash. Here you have so many of these people that were obeying the rules, even when the rules were unconstitutional, going back to the lockdown just a few weeks ago, few months ago. And then they see this. Okay, well, these are people that are obviously violating laws of the land. And so to deal with an injustice, what's the solution? Rampant injustice. That's what our leaders think. That's what our law enforcement officials think. And to see these sights, police officers, military men, kneeling before Black Lives Matter, kneeling before these these domestic terrorist groups. That's what they are. Antifa has the upper hand. We'll show you some more disturbing footage from Minneapolis here in just a moment. They have the upper hand. The mayor of London, he's out there with the protesters. On Saturday, he says, to the thousands of Londoners who responded peacefully, I stand with you and I share your anger and your pain. Well, what about the thousands who didn't respond peacefully? Does he stand with them? Who stands against them? Because from what we can see, the police are sprinting in the opposite direction. The BBC had a headline, not unlike that CNN reporter from a week or two ago. The CNN reporter, remember, he's standing in front of the burning building saying, it's mostly peaceful. BBC said 27 policemen injured in mostly peaceful protests, something to that effect. Just ridiculous. They won't even tell you the truth. Here are these protesters setting off fireworks, throwing objects at policemen. These are third world scenes. And then you have Winston Churchill statue. Graffiti put on that. The police, by the way, were guarding that statue at a moment or for a time, and then they took off because it was getting too tense. So the police had to leave, and then here comes the person who vandalizes it. We've lost control. Even the Abraham Lincoln statue in Parliament Square was attacked. Abraham Lincoln. Even he doesn't escape. You would think the black community would celebrate Mr. Lincoln, but oh no, that's not what they've been taught. You see all this graffiti around London. Racism is a pandemic too. Silence is violence. You better speak up and you better say something. In some cases, you're intimidated into saying something. You're intimidated into kneeling, as I said on Friday. And then all these calls to abolish the police. We'll come to that here in just a second. I want to comment on this Colston statue. This is a statue down in Bristol. And over the weekend, rioters down there, they tore down the statue, and then they dragged the statue across the city near the harbor and dumped it into the harbor. This is, again, here in the UK over the weekend, clip 13. As the people cheer, whipped into a frenzy, as we covered last week. What about this Colston figure of history? He lived from 1636 to 1721, and Richard pulled together a few stats or a few details on his bio. He didn't have any heirs to speak of. He was a wealthy and successful businessman. So he left a lot of his money to charity, and he did a lot for the city of Bristol. That's down south of here, about 2 hours from Edstone. He set up houses for the poor. He established a hospital, Mr. Colston. He set up a school to educate poor boys. This is from a pamphlet regarding the statue and his contribution to the city. Bristol University published this in 1999. That's 21 years ago, this pamphlet. So I'm sure it's much different today. But in any event, let me take you back just 21 years to when people weren't insane on a mass scale. It says, wherever one casts one's eye in Bristol, it's difficult to escape the legacy of Edward Colston. Various streets and the city's main concert hall are named after him. 2 schools and some of Bristol's best preserved almshouses bear his name. And the bronze statue of his figure, leaning over a tall cane, stands in the middle of Colston Avenue in the city center. That's the one you just saw got torn down and thrown into the harbor. It says, it's fitting that there should be so many reminders of Colston in modern Bristol, for he was the most famous philanthropist born in the city who contributed to local charities and education. Did you get that? The most famous philanthropist born in the city who contributed to local charities and education. That came out from the educational system of Britain 21 years ago. And today, well, you have young people, you have protesters, hooligans, you have rioters pulling it down and dragging it into the harbor. Edward Colston never did marry. He was quoted as saying, "Every helpless widow is my wife, and her distressed orphans, my children." He was just a community servant, quite unlike the people you see protesting, quite unlike the people you see making demands to law enforcement. You get down and kneel before me. You take a knee. He worked to reinforce upright morals. He encouraged proper Sabbath observance, as he called it. Of course, that was Sunday keeping. He didn't know any better. He worked to eliminate begging, unruliness, swearing, and gambling. We do not want him as part of our community anymore, say the residents of Bristol. In his will, he asked for a modest funeral so that the money could be left for the poor, but the city disobeyed his last wishes because they loved him so much. They gave him an extravagant funeral. They just loved him so much. On his tomb were inscribed the words, "His extreme charity is well known to many parts of this kingdom, but more particularly to this city, Bristol, where the benefactions have exceeded all others, a list of which is on his monument as followeth." This is how the pamphlet produced by Bristol University in 1999, this is how it concludes. It says, "Even today, Colston's Boys' School and Colston's Girls' School hold separate services at Bristol Cathedral to celebrate their father's birthday. On these occasions, pupils dress in full uniform, old boys and girls attend, and the chair and the governors reads from Colston settlements. These services remind us that Colston's endowments, which were continued by his trustees after his death, still benefit charitable organizations today and provide educational support for people in modern Bristol, irrespective of their racial background." That's in the pamphlet from 1999. But there was one point in his life for about a year where he worked for the Royal African country, and this was a company that was engaged in slave trade. So because he was associated with that company for a year, that ruins it. The history must be erased. The history must be buried. The history must be tossed into the harbor. It's too offensive. I suppose it's like Drew Brees' comments from last week. It's just going to make minorities tear up and get emotional from the hurt and the pain. So much pain. Where are the adults to stand up to this psychological warfare, this insanity? Where are the adults to enforce the laws of the community? Churchill, by the way, Richard tweeted this out today. You know the quote about him rather choking in his own blood upon the ground than to surrender to tyranny. And yet that's what we see so many people doing in our communities, in our big cities. They're just surrendering to the forces of tyranny. It's a sign, isn't it? Like Luke 26 says, it's a sign that our will is broken. We usually think about the broken will with respect to threats from without, not confronting threats abroad. But look at the broken will that's on display. It's on display every day. And then the media are there, and in truth, they are the virus. They're the virus. The BBC is there to say, hey, we had 27 police officers injured, but thankfully it was a peaceful protest. What? There is a burning building behind me, but thankfully it's a peaceful protest. We did have a policeman murdered in California and St. Louis, but thankfully this has been mostly peaceful. Justice for George. Is that what this is about? Jacob Fry, he's the mayor, the very youngish mayor from Minneapolis. And you'll remember he's the one that has just been groveling before these communist mobs, clearing out the 3rd Precinct so that the rioters could burn it to the ground. He told the police to stand down as the rioters burned down the city of Minneapolis. It says here, quoting him, "The symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life or our officers or the public. We could not risk serious injury to anyone. We don't want to have an officer injured. We don't want to have a rioter injured. So just let them burn down the building." Can you imagine if you took this thinking right across the nation, what it would result in? But yet that's the way law enforcement thinks. Here in the UK, they're running from the protesters. They evacuate the area around the Churchill statue. Over the weekend, Mr. Fry, the mayor, he was kneeling before the casket of George Floyd, sobbing for more than a minute. And then he's out. I don't know if this was from Saturday or yesterday, but he's out in front of Black Lives Matter, apologizing for his racist DNA, and I suppose for all the others in the white race. Here's clip 1.
I've been coming to grips with my own brokenness in this situation, my own failures, my own shortcomings, and I know there needs to be deep-seated structural reform in terms of how the department operates. The systemically racist system needs to be revamped. Okay. The police union needs to be put in its place.
So there he is apologizing for his own shortcomings and then saying that there needs to be dramatic reform in the police. The system is corrupt. Systemic racism. This is very similar to what Barack Obama's been saying for years, from the start of his presidency all the way through to the current crisis. This is from last week, that town hall that he was a part of, the virtual town hall, clip 7.
Most of the reforms that are needed to prevent the type of violence and injustices that we've seen take place at the local level. Now, reform has to take place in more than 19,000 American municipalities, more than 18,000 local enforcement jurisdictions.
19,000 American municipalities. I don't know the exact figures, but I assume he's throwing that out there because it represents all of them. All of them. There needs to be reform in every single one. So the mayor of Minneapolis, he's out there in front of Black Lives Matter, and he says there needs to be reform, certainly, in the police department here in Minneapolis. And listen to the demands that Black Lives Matter makes to this mayor of Minneapolis. Clip 2.
Yes or no, will you commit to defunding Minneapolis Police Department? What did I say? We don't want no more police. Is that clear? We don't want people with guns toting around in our community, shooting us down. You have an answer? It is a yes or a no. It is a yes or a no. Will you defund the Minneapolis Police Department?
They're demanding that they abolish the police. No more police. No more police officers with guns because, keep in mind, every single one of them is Derek Chauvin. Every single one. I assume she even means the police chief, who is black. No more police. No more funding for the police. No more police with guns. And can you, Mr. Mayor, can you say that you'll abolish the police? Well, this is a radical, far left-wing mayor, And he said, well, I can't go that far. I'm not for the the abolishment of the police. And so here's how the mob responded. Clip 3.
I do not support the full abolition of the police.
All right! Get out of here! Go! Get out of here!
That's the radical left eating its own. And we're going to see a lot more of that before this is all over. I went back, by the way. This is the August 2015 Trumpet magazine. Police under attack. That was the cover. And just, it's amazing how prescient the Trumpet always is. This is my father's article on page 2. It says, it would be overstating it to say there is no racism among Americans' law enforcement officers, but there are some few who are scrutinizing and magnifying this issue for evil purposes. That's what's going on here. They're scrutinizing every little move for evil purposes, and no wonder the police are running. They don't want a confrontation. You really have to wonder if it will ever be the same between police officers and minorities with respect to apprehending someone or questioning someone or arresting someone. This is not going to go away. The violence and such may die down. It looks like it already has here in the U.S. But what a stain. What a stain. This is putting a permanent stain on law enforcement, so much so that they want to get rid of it. That's the thinking in the Minneapolis City Council. 9 out of 12 voted to get rid of the police. You think it's kind of like a joke headline from Babylon Bee or The Onion. But as I played for you last week, the mayor of LA is already defunding the police. And now here comes Minneapolis. My father wrote 5 years ago, they're using it dishonestly to explain or excuse some terrifying, dangerous behavior. They're stirring up emotion and anger, but none of it is truly intended to solve the problem. It says the results are inciting evils that are quickly becoming far worse than those they purport to solve. The nation's police are being undermined in ways that will prove devastating to our cities in particular. This is an article we put together 5 years ago. It's going to devastate our cities, we wrote. This attack on law enforcement. It was especially intense during the Obama years, and there has been no let-up. Of course, during the Obama years, he was searching far and wide for some kind of injustice between law enforcement and minorities, so much so that they were making it up, like they did in Ferguson, like they did with Trayvon, like they did with the Cambridge police. Even Freddie Gray, making it up, defending the thugs. Now they have an incident of police brutality, and it just confirms everything that they've been told for going on a generation. Even more, really. There's been some articles about just how, going back to even 1968, and how that was a turning point, particularly in the way that the media covered it. Pointing out that, well, it's been violent. There have been casualties, but in some ways it's justified because they've been mistreated. That thinking was there. The seeds were planted then, but now it's just widespread, this reaction from law enforcement, from the media, from the politicians. Just step aside and let them carry out the violence. And then when it happens, just make sure that you know it's not really violence. It doesn't really count as violence. 9 of the council's 12 members in Minneapolis, they voted to dismantle the department. It's headed up by Jeremiah Ellison, and he's Keith Ellison's son. That's the attorney general in Minnesota. And keep in mind, as I've noted, from top to bottom, governor right on down to the city of Minneapolis. This is a state that's been ruled by the left wing, the far radical left, for more than 50 years. Well, the city anyway. I don't know all their governors, Republican and Democrat. But so many of our big cities, it's the same story. Radical left-wing government. Ilhan Omar, she's from the region. She represents a region in Minnesota. She says it's time to disband. She said this over the weekend. It's time to disband the Minneapolis Police Department. You think it's just some far-left kook commentator at the Daily Cost that says this? This is a congresswoman. I will never co-sign on funding a police department that continues to brutalize us, and I will never stop saying not only do we need to disinvest police, but we need to completely dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. Now, how are these people, what are they thinking? What do they think will fill that vacuum? Who will run the city? You take away the policemen and their guns. Does that remove all the guns? She says the Minneapolis Police Department is rotten to the root. See, they're all Derek Chauvin, top to bottom. Well, why didn't the black police chief do something about it then? He had the authority. He had a far left or mayor in charge of the city, in charge of the department. It says, and so when we dismantle it, we get rid of that cancer and we allow for something to rise. Think about this reasoning. So if we get rid of the cancer, something will rise. What will be the something? She kind of indicates that she doesn't even know, but that's okay. Let's just try it. She says, and that reimagining allows us to figure out what public safety looks like. Wow. It sounds perfect. Everyone living in peace and harmony. We can imagine it. Well, you can imagine it. It's just that it never works. It makes things worse. Last week, Heather McDonald, we went through her article at the Wall Street Journal, or I forget where she wrote it, but she gave some statistics. You know, facts about the black community. They matter too, don't they? Black lives matter. What about facts? And she's reported on the facts. What about the homicides? You may have seen footage of this African-American woman. I think she's around the Washington, D.C. area. She's actually confronted some of the protesters and said, where were you when we had 10 blacks shot dead over Chicago Memorial Day weekend? How come you didn't protest then? Bunch of hypocrites, she says. Well, here is Heather McDonald. She lives in Manhattan, and she's been in a lot of city council meetings talking about law enforcement and hearing from the community. And she's seen community member after another saying, we need more police. When there's more police, we feel safer. When I hear those comments about just getting rid of the Minneapolis police altogether, I think of that poor old woman, the clip we played last Monday. She was crying, saying that, everything around me's been burned down. I don't have transportation. She said, in some ways, I wish I was with George Floyd in some other better place. Do you think she wants fewer policemen or more? It's like my father said in the article. Of course, there's a case here and there, and they need to be judged individually. That's justice. If it was justice for George Floyd, if that was the main goal here, well, people would be applauding Donald Trump because of how quickly the DOJ got moving on that case. Instead, they're going after Donald Trump because it's all about him. This is a perfect opportunity to attack a president, one of the few in the world today, who is standing up, or at least speaking out, for law and order. Going back to the front lines, though, here's Heather McDonald just giving you some facts. Clip 8.
In 2015 and 2016, when we went through what now is, in retrospect, a minimal amount of civil unrest and riots throughout the country, 2,000 additional black males were killed because cops backed off of policing. Right now, we already have seen crime going through the roof. We've already seen the assassinations of cops. I fear we're going to see more. And who are the people who are going to be hurt when these cops back off? If we defund the cops, we don't even need to defund them. The delegitimation of them is so great. The hatred that is being directed at them when they arrest gangbangers, gun toters, people who've just shot innocent children in the city. The hatred being directed at officers is extraordinary. Who's going to be hurt? The thousands of law-abiding residents of inner-city neighborhoods who beg for more police protection. People like a cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who told me, please, Jesus, send more police, because the only time she feels safe to go into her building lobby is when the cops are there, because it's otherwise colonized by trespassing youth, selling drugs, and smoking weed. There was an elderly lady in the 41st precinct of the South Bronx who stood up in the middle of a community meeting and said, how lovely when we see the police. They are my friends. These are the voices that the media deliberately silences because they completely undermine their phony narrative about systemic police racism and white supremacy in this country.
Why would the media deliberately silence those voices? Those are, I presume they're coming out of the Bronx, so we can presume they're minority voices, perhaps. Please, please send more police. I don't feel safe to go down to the lobby of my apartment building unless there's a policeman there. Please, please send more help. When the cops back away, more black lives will die. That can be proven, even as recently as 2015 and 16, just like Heather McDonald said. More people die when the police disappear, not less, more. And yet people are whipped into this frenzy, thinking that this is the solution. And where are the educators to tell them, well, hang on a second, you don't want that. You hear it for the first time last week. You say in your heart, it's crazy. But people don't stand against it. They don't answer it back with strength and courage. And so eventually it becomes a reality. It might well become that in Minneapolis, as crazy as it is. And as much as it would hurt the people of Minneapolis, to the tune of hundreds, thousands perhaps, actually physically hurt them. But that's what the mob wants. So will the mob get it? Well, they're in the perfect state. You've got a far-left governor. You've got a far-left mayor. You've got a police force that's in retreat, that's clearing out the precincts for the rioters. And then you've got Black Lives Matter and Antifa on the streets, calling for change. There needs to be change. Well, they're getting some pretty dramatic change. And meanwhile, many others in America are heading to the gun shop to purchase guns and ammunition. 6 million guns sold in 3 months. Lots and lots of guns, lots and lots of ammunition. There's a backlash building that's brought out in a commentary piece. Because as I said earlier, you have all these people that were being just think about for one, you had a couple months ago, you had a lot of law-abiding citizens who were very upset with law enforcement, at least those that were going into parks and arresting mothers because they were violating social distance rules created by a governor, by a decree. And then now you've got the communist mob chasing down policemen, running them over, beating them to a bloody pulp, shooting them in the head from behind. Now, in that environment, with that, supposing you were a young man and you thought about the police academy and going into the law enforcement profession, you'd be thinking twice about that now. To say nothing of the ones that are already leaving police forces. Like that group of, I think, 57 in Buffalo. Nobody will stand behind law enforcement. In some cases, not even the police chief. Mayors are abandoning them. Politicians are abandoning them. The media, what they're doing, and it doesn't matter, even if they change within a matter of weeks. Listen to this clip from Joe Scarborough. This was just 2 weeks ago. This was before the Floyd video. This was when the story 24/7 was locked down. Don't you dare violate the rules, the regulations. We've got to flatten the curve. And here's what Joe Scarborough said on MSNBC, clip 6.
When you see as many Americans coming together as they did to bend the curve, you suddenly realize that pictures of people carrying military-style weapons and screaming and yelling and abusing law enforcement officers.
He's talking about the protests in Michigan there a few weeks ago. And he said, well, just, you can hear what he said right there. It's chilling. It's appalling to go after law enforcement officers that way, yelling and abusing them. That seems like decades ago now, doesn't it? That's all we've been seeing in the last 2 weeks. Not just yelling and abusing, killing. And how much longer before thousands and thousands of blacks in the inner cities are being gunned down by one another, by criminals? Either because the police force is being downsized, or maybe in the extreme removed. But at the very least, you've got police that are going to be a lot more inclined to just back away, to avoid bad neighborhoods. Good police, law-abiding police that before the last 2 weeks were just out there trying to actually help people, and in some cases, saving people's lives. Last week, there was a letter sent out by these healthcare professionals who said, don't shut down the protests using coronavirus concerns as an excuse. So everything else had to be shut down, right on up to the Floyd tape. But now here come the experts to say, as I was commenting on last week, hey, social justice, that trumps social distancing. So get out there and protest. Never mind the virus. It says staying at home. 1,200 people signed this letter. 1,200 experts. 1,200 health professionals. It says staying at home, social distancing, and public masking are effective at minimizing the spread of COVID-19. To the extent possible, we support the application of these public health best practices during demonstrations that call attention to the pervasive lethal force of white supremacy. However, as public health advocates, we do not condemn these gatherings as risky for COVID-19 transmission. So, as this author of the commentary piece points out, what are the law-abiding citizens who've been shutting down their businesses, protesting peacefully, not going to parks, not going to restaurants? What are these people going to be thinking now that here come the health experts saying, hey, to the hooligans, go out and protest, go out and riot. Don't let COVID-19 slow you down. These experts, these doctors said this should not be confused with a permissive stance on all gatherings, particularly protests against stay-at-home orders. In other words, unless you're out with Black Lives Matter, you just stay home, okay? And again, you read this the first time and think, is this really for real? Are they really, after what they were saying nonstop for 2 months, are they really just abruptly turning on a dime and saying, hey, did you see the pictures from Philadelphia yesterday? Tens of thousands of people flooding the streets within inches of one another, Now, if what we were told just 2 weeks ago is true, there is going to be some kind of massive outbreak of COVID-19 in Pennsylvania and beyond. Because that's what they were saying. Remember when they were talking about the people at the pool or remember, Memorial Day weekend was just 2 weeks ago. Play the montage, Sam, from just 2 weeks ago. Here's what the commentators were all saying. Clip 4.
We have to maintain that physical distance.
To make sure people are wearing masks while they're walking around town and maintaining social distance.
During this reopening, social gatherings should not be more than 10 people, even if they're outside.
Images of these large crowds at beaches on Saturday, at outdoor restaurants, water parks, not keeping social distance.
This does not look like social distancing to me. Should the health department come in and start arresting people or issuing citations?
But many are not practicing social distancing, and there have been shocking scenes.
Crowds pack the sand, many ignoring social distancing.
I guess when you see the beaches of Alabama crowded with people, no social distancing, not wearing masks.
Showed hundreds of people blatantly ignoring signs to practice social distancing.
Those were mostly 2 weeks ago, 14, 15, 16 days ago, Memorial Day weekend. And now, incredibly, you saw it in that letter from all the experts. Don't let COVID-19 slow you down if you want to go out and join Black Lives Matter and Antifa. But if it's any other reason, remember social distancing. So, like Noah Rothman says at commentary, what are people who've been obeying the social distancing and who aren't shooting up stores, who were told, by the way, shut down your store? And then they're seeing, again, in the name of justice, all of this injustice. Listen to Rachel Maddow. This is 17 days ago, May 22nd, and she's talking about all the people that were happy to get out and about again in Alabama. And she said, just wait. You're only 2 weeks away from an outbreak. Clip 5.
Part of the happy talk that we're getting right now, particularly on the political right, is that, look, the reopening's happening and everything's fine. Everything's fine. Well, first of all, when people get exposed, it takes a couple of weeks for it to turn up in terms of people getting tested, having positive results, and turning up in the hospital and ultimately turning up critically ill. And so all the premature celebration about, look how great the opening up is ignorant. But this idea that it's just a theoretical that our healthcare systems will be overtaxed or will come to capacity as reopening fuels a surge in more cases. It's not a hypothetical. It's happening right now in Montgomery, Alabama. Ignoring that because you like the idea of reopening doesn't make that go away.
That's just 2 weeks ago. So who's ignorant here? Who's covering the truth? They turned on a dime. Get outside. Go riot. Well, there's damage being done. Well, that's because there's a lot of pent-up rage. So it's justified. No care, no concern, nothing whatever for social distancing. Now it's all about social justice and the backlash that comes from this. Commentary, it says, you could spend all day itemizing the hypocrisies we've had to endure. Suffice it to say, the contempt of these lawmakers toward their most complacent citizens appears boundless. They were never the dispassionate, data-driven empiricists they pretended to be, but you might think at least the disregard these protesters have shown toward social distancing guidelines has shattered the consensus around the value of lockdown. You'd be wrong. In other words, they're now turning back, since the rioting's dying down, they're now turning back to demand lockdown, masks, or at least social distancing. They certainly don't want to see any improvements in the economy. And of course, in the case of the United States, that's exactly what happened on Friday, when everybody was saying or forecasting 7.5 million jobs lost in May. I think the Washington Post came out and said that unemployment was going to skyrocket to 20%. Then they had to go and delete that tweet because the jobs report came out for May and it was 2.5 million jobs added. And I think it took President Trump all of about 2 seconds to get out on the White House lawn to celebrate, because he's certainly not going to get any fair and truthful reporting from the media. This is what the president had to say Friday, clip 10.
We're going to be stronger than we were when we were riding high. And our stock market is it's just short of an all-time high. I've had 144 all-time high stock markets during a 3.5-year period. Nobody's ever come close to that, and we're going to do it again. But it's going to be even stronger than last time. When I would say that to you 2-3 months ago, I could see what's happened. I have a good feel. I've always done well with numbers, but I had a feel for it. I said it even the other day. I was saying, I think we're going to have a tremendous next year. I think it's going to be a phenomenal next year.
That was quite an amazing press conference on Friday. When you consider what his administration has had to battle and confront, well, really for almost 4 years, I guess, but even just this year, the economy's coming into 2020. It's humming on all cylinders. He takes out Soleimani, and of course the media said this is the beginning of World War III. There's going to be nuclear war now as a result of that. And then the impeachment over nothing. Impeached for a phone call. That was in late January, early February. And then the virus that the media assured was nothing to worry about. But impeachment was over, so we got to do something. We got to use something to bludgeon him with. So the virus, and then the total lockdown. They just came into my office. The experts, they just came into my office and said, we've got to lock everything down. What? And he went along with it. And so did the Boris Johnson government here in the UK, and so did the Western world. So did much of the world as we know it today. There was that. Then it finally there are signs. States reopening. And then there's one case of police brutality caught on tape. The media turn on a dime. Widespread rioting and burning, a breakdown of law and order, an attack on law enforcement. And yet he still just keeps plugging away. He keeps standing against it. I gave you this quote last week. It's from Great again. In the face of such problems, our people have become faint-hearted, too cowardly to do what needs to be done. We are afraid of almost everything, it seems, because we don't know God and we don't let him empower us and give us the courage that we need. We need that in God's church. And to some degree, we have a pretty good example of it in the Trump administration in the United States. One man standing up for law and order, standing up to the demonic radical left, standing up to the communist mob. He's showing some courage. I think I played that clip for you last week, Victor Davis Hanson, saying, look, we just need someone now who's brave enough to step forward and say, that's enough, no more. That's enough. That's enough with the violence. That's enough with the arson and the murder and the looting. For 8 years, my father wrote, for 8 years under Barack Obama, the forces of the radical left were on the march, virtually unchecked. Even Republican leaders caved in. And that was after they had taken control of Congress and had a lot of power to stop the president. It says Donald Trump has proved himself willing to take a stand where others have not. If anything, from these last few months, these crises that we've seen over and again, if anything, it shows us that we have to be courageous enough to take a stand. Even this verse we're very familiar with, Isaiah 40 and verse 9. O Zion, or O you that tell good tidings to Zion and to Jerusalem, that bring good tidings, it says, lift up your voice with strength. Lift it up. God says. Be not afraid. Don't be afraid. And you see this over and again in the major and minor prophets. God encouraging his servants. No, don't be afraid. You stand up to it. If you bow down to it, if you kneel down to it, that's just weakness. That's what the mayor of Minneapolis did. And then look at the demands. Stand up. Lift up your voice with strength. And be not afraid. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily radio show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send comments to td@kpcg.fm. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you tomorrow.